Picture a mother standing in the middle of her own kitchen, and every other person in the house, her 7 children, her mother, her father, frozen in place around her like furniture, not asleep, stopped, and she is the only thing still moving. That is the image at the center of this case, and what makes it worse is where it happened. Almost every famous version of this story happens where no one can see a dark highway, a parked car, a single witness with no one to back them up. This one happened at the kitchen table, at supper time, in a house full of people. And the small gray beings who did it, the ones the world now calls the Greys, 4 feet tall, huge black eyes, walking in through a closed door as if it weren't there, did not catch Betty Andreasson alone. They caught her surrounded and switched her family off like a light. On the evening of January 25, 1967, in South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, a mother named Betty Andreasson was cleaning up in her kitchen while her 7 children watched television in the next room. Her parents were visiting. Her husband was not there. He was in the hospital after a car accident, so the house was full in the way a house is full when one adult is holding it together alone. An ordinary winter night. I want to lay out what happened plainly, and then do the hard part, which is deciding what to make of it, because this is one of the most heavily investigated abduction cases on record, and also one of the strangest, and the 2 facts are connected. Start with the parts that had witnesses. At about 6:35, the lights in the house flickered and went dark for a moment. Then a pulsing reddish light came through the kitchen window. The children were frightened by the sudden dark, and Betty went to calm them. Her father crossed to the window to see where the light was coming from, and he saw, by his own account, several small figures crossing the yard toward the house. Listen to how he described them, because it is the most important sentence in the case that did not come from hypnosis. He did not say aliens, or monsters, or greys, or any of the words we now have. He reached for what he saw and landed on this. They looked like children in Halloween costumes, small bodies, something wrong with the faces, and they did not walk so much as hop, the way a kid in a too big costume hops. That is, a grandfather at a kitchen window in 1967. And in 1967, there was no template to reach for, no standard alien, no gray, no bug-eyed image to borrow. He had only the one comparison a man of his time and place had for a small figure with a wrong face moving strangely across a yard, and he used it. Nobody coaches a detail like that into a witness. It is too homely, too specific, too unlike the story it became. And then, according to Betty and to the family, the figures came through the closed wooden door of the house, and the moment they did, everyone but Betty stopped, not fell asleep. Stopped held in place, mid-motion, the children, the grandparents, the whole room suspended, while Betty alone stayed awake inside it. And that detail is the thing that makes this case cut differently, because the protection did not fail. It was overruled. 9 people standing in a full house, the exact arrangement of bodies that is supposed to mean nothing can reach you, and not one of them able to lift a hand, and afterward, not one of them able to swear they had seen it happen. If it is true, the safest room in the world was breached while it was full, and it kept nothing out for longer than it takes light to cross a window. The beings, as she described them, were about 4 feet tall, with large pear-shaped heads, wide dark slanted eyes, gray skin, and tight blue coveralls marked with the emblem of a bird. They had no mouth that moved. Where a mouth should be was a slit, and yet she understood them, because they spoke inside her head rather than out loud. This is, now, the completely standard picture of the gray alien. In 1967, it was not standard yet, and that will matter later. What they did next is where the case stops resembling anyone else's. They took her out of the house and aboard a craft, where she was examined the familiar, awful catalog of it, including a needle passed up into her nose, a procedure she had no framework to describe and no reason to invent. But the examination is not the center of Betty's story, and this is what makes her case genuinely different. What she described next was not a medical nightmare. It was a religious vision. She said she was taken through a dark tunnel into another place, a landscape of crystalline structures, of light, unlike anywhere on Earth. She described beings of light. She described being shown a book she was later made to forget. And at the center of it, she described an enormous bird, wreathed in fire, so overwhelming that the only word her ordinary vocabulary could find for it was a phoenix. She watched it burn down to ash in front of her. And then, in the ash, she watched something small stir and begin again. She understood, without being told in words, that she was being shown the thing itself, not a bird, but the machinery under living and dying, the turning of one into the other. And she came away from it not traumatized, exactly, but changed, convinced she had been shown something true, that the beings were not predators but messengers, that the whole terrifying event had been, underneath, a kind of instruction. A devout Christian before that night, she folded what happened to her into her faith, rather than against it. She did not think she had met monsters. She thought, in some sense she struggled to explain, that she had been allowed to glimpse the machinery of life and death itself. Stay with how strange that is for a moment, because it cuts in a direction you don't expect. When someone comes back from a horror, describing it as a horror, we know how to hear that. When someone comes back from a horror describing it as a revelation calm, even grateful, the instinct is to relax, to file it under religious experience and let it go. But look at it a second longer. A woman is taken out of her own kitchen, past her frozen children, subjected to something she cannot control, and returns believing it was done for her benefit, by beings she should be furious at, and instead feels chosen. That is not the shape of a comforting dream. That is the shape of something that got inside the place where she decides what things mean, and rearranged it. The piece is the unsettling part. For 10 years, she told almost no one. Then, in 1975, she read a newspaper piece about the UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek, who was asking the public to send in their experiences, and she wrote a short letter. It sat in a file, too thin to act on, until early 1977, when investigators finally came to talk to her. And what they built around her over the next year is the reason this case is not just another strange story. And here is where the case turns on itself, because the strongest thing it has is also not the thing it first appears to be. A team formed around Betty, a MUFON investigator named Jules Vaillancourt at first, then Raymond Fowler, a serious and initially skeptical researcher who would end up spending years and 5 books on her. And this was not 2 hobbyists with a tape recorder. The team included a solar physicist, an electronics engineer, an aerospace engineer, and a telecommunications specialist, technical people, trained to distrust a soft answer. Over 12 months, they ran a character reference check on her, gave her 2 separate lie detector tests, had her interviewed by a psychiatrist, and conducted 14 lengthy hypnotic regression sessions led by Harold Edelstein, director of the New England Institute of Hypnosis. When it was over, the investigation ran to a report of 528 pages, and she passed all of it. The polygraph tests indicated she was telling the truth. The psychiatrist came away with no doubt that she genuinely believed everything she described. Under hypnosis, she relived the night with what the investigators recorded as authentic physiological reactions. The fear, the pain, the wonder arriving in her body in real time, not performed, but suffered. When the needle went up her nose, on the couch 10 years later, she flinched and wept as though it were happening again. Her daughter Becky, who had been in the house that night, was regressed too, and gave an account that matched. And Betty, who could draw, produced page after page of detailed sketches, the craft's interior, the beings, the emblem, with a consistency across sessions that impressed even the skeptics on the team. So here is a woman with no apparent motive, no history of instability, no financial gain, corroborated in part by her own daughter, who passed a polygraph, satisfied a psychiatrist, and drew the same impossible things over and over without contradiction. If you wanted a witness built to be believed, you would build this one. And now I have to take it apart, because the thing that makes the case so strong is also, exactly, the thing that makes it impossible to close. Every piece of the story that matters, the beings, the craft, the phoenix, the whole interior journey reached the world through hypnosis, a decade after the fact. And that is the crack the entire case falls into, though not for the reason people usually give. Here is the reason. The regression sessions were not quiet clinical retrievals. They were events, a room full of investigators present at times, the physicist, the engineers, Fowler himself, men who had already given months to this and wanted badly for it to be real, leaning in around a deeply suggestible woman as she was guided back into the worst night of her life. Think about what that room is. A hypnotized person's whole instinct is turned toward pleasing the calm voice, asking the questions, and here that voice had an audience, and the audience had a hope, and Betty could feel all of it. Nobody had to lie or coach or plant a thing. A sincere, suggestible woman performing for people who ache for a particular answer will drift toward it without anyone intending it, and believe every word, because that is what this does. It does not recover memory. It builds it, vivid and indistinguishable, from the real thing, from the inside, which is why the polygraph proves less than it seems. A polygraph measures belief, not truth, and by 1977, Betty wholly believed what those sessions had assembled. Sincerity was never the question. Sincerity is the one thing this method guarantees. And there is a fact about the man running those sessions I have to put on the table, because a sharp viewer will find it anyway. The hypnotist, Harold Edelstein, is also the man who, in those same years, conducted the regressions in another of the era's most cited cases, Buff Ledge, in Vermont. 2 teenagers, the same recovered under hypnosis structure. 2 of the independent abduction cases that helped build the modern template ran through the same chair. That proves neither was manufactured. But it means they are not the 2 separate confirmations they're presented as, and it rests enormous weight on one method, in one pair of hands. Then there is the timing. Betty came forward in the wake of the Betty and Barney Hill case, which had by then been a best-selling book and a television film, and which had already planted the gray-skinned, large-eyed, telepathic being in the culture. So the possibility is unavoidable that the standard alien did not originate in Betty's kitchen in '67, but arrived in her mind across the decade after, from the same cultural air the rest of us were breathing, and came back out on Edelstein's couch wearing the authority of memory. Put those together, a decade's delay, a suggestible method in one much-used pair of hands, a full room hoping for a particular answer, and a culture that had already drawn the alien's face, and you have enough, between them, to account for very nearly everything that came off those tapes. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Very nearly everything, but not the whole of it, and the reason is a line I want to draw straight down the middle of this case, divide it by who was awake. Everything spectacular in the story came from the couch. The craft, the examination, the phoenix, the interior journey, all of it recovered under hypnosis. A decade later, in that crowded, hoping room, set every bit of it aside, grant the skeptic the entire contents of those 14 sessions. You are still left with what happened before anyone was hypnotized, in real time, to people wide awake. The darkness when the lights failed, the red light in the kitchen window, the grandfather frightened at the glass by hopping figures with wrong faces, the children scared by all of it, and a whole household that agreed for 10 years before a single investigator knocked that something had come there they could not explain. Hypnosis built the phoenix. It did not build the light in the window, or the man at the glass, or the decade of sober conviction that came before any session. And one thing off the couch the tidy explanation still cannot place. Under hypnosis, more than one investigator reported, Betty at times began to speak fluently, at length in a language none of them recognized, a woman with 10 years of schooling who had never traveled or studied a tongue that wasn't English. Call it gibberish. Maybe it was. But it is a strange thing for a mind borrowing a cultural script to produce, because there was no script for that. The Hill case gave her grays. It did not give her a language. And the corroboration is not nothing. Betty's daughter, separately regressed, relived the same night. The skeptic answers, fairly, that a mother and daughter who lived the aftermath together for 10 years could have braided a single account between them without either one lying, and that answer may be right. But notice that even the skeptical version requires something to have happened first, some real and frightening event on that January night, around which the two of them later built a shared and elaborated memory. The skeptic explains the elaboration. The skeptic does not explain the seed. And this is where I have to talk about the gratitude, because it is the part I trust least and cannot dismiss most. If Betty had set out to invent a story, or her mind to invent one for her, it would have been so much easier to invent a simple one, a fright, a light, a lost hour. Instead, the account is cluttered with things that win her nothing and cost her plenty. A burning bird, a book she was shown and made to forget, a sense of mission her own investigators found embarrassing. That split the team and made serious men worry. The whole case was a religious experience in alien costume. People inventing stories to be believed do not, as a rule, load them with the exact material that makes them harder to believe. Betty did. Whatever drove the account, it is not shaped like something built to persuade. Raymond Fowler spent years on this, and it did not leave him where it found him. He came to it a conventional, skeptical, deeply Christian man, and the case pulled his faith apart and made him reassemble it. He came to believe he might be an abductee himself. You can read that as a man who lost his objectivity to a story he got too close to. You can also read it as a man who looked longer and harder than anyone alive and could not make it resolve into either a lie or a delusion. He wrote, in his own notes, that if it was a delusion, it had a coherence and depth he had never encountered, and that if it was not, then something was reaching into human beings and shaping what they believe, for reasons we do not understand. Those were the only two doors he could find. Neither is comfortable. I cannot tell you a craft landed in a yard in South Ashburnham in 1967 and that gray beings walked through a wooden door and stopped a family in place. The load-bearing parts of that account come from hypnosis, which builds sincere, detailed, false memories in careful, honest people all the time, and a woman reliving her deepest fears for a room full of believers is the least reliable witness we know how to make. But I cannot file it under nothing, either. A mother carried this silently for 10 years before she said a word, and then submitted herself to polygraphs and psychiatrists and 14 sessions of reliving it, and came out not with a story that comforted her, but with one that made everyone around her uneasy, herself included. The safest place there is a kitchen with your family in it at supper time. That is the whole meaning of a kitchen, and what this case has been asking, quietly, for more than 50 years, is what you do with an ordinary, sane, unshakable woman who says the safest place there is did not protect her, that whatever came through that closed door walked past every person she loved, took her, and returned her, not broken, but convinced. Because that is the thing I keep circling back to, the gratitude. A frightened woman I could file away, a traumatized one I could hand to a psychiatrist, and a decade of bad dreams. But Betty Andreasson came back from being taken out of her own kitchen, past her frozen children, and told everyone, for the rest of her life, against every interest she had, that it had not come to hurt her. It had come to show her something: the burning bird, the ash, the thing beginning again in the ash, and she was grateful to have seen it. The peace is the part that will not sit still. Terror, you can explain. It is the thankfulness, in a woman that unremarkable and that sane, that I have never been able to get warm to, or explain away, or leave behind.